I'd like to welcome you to the 28th Annual Karen E. Wetterhahn Science Symposium, the celebration of undergraduate science research at Dartmouth. This year, we are pleased to have as our keynote speaker Dr. Paulina Jaramillo. Dr. Jaramillo is originally from Medellin, Colombia. She did her bachelor's degree in civil and environmental engineering from Florida International University, master's degree and PhD in civil and environmental engineering with an emphasis on green design from Carnegie Mellon University. She's been on the faculty in the Department of Engineering at Carnegie Mellon since 2010. Through her research, Dr. Jaramillo aims to create knowledge that will be required to meet global energy needs. And she'll be talking about that as well as sort of aspects of her career. So we welcome you, Dr. Jaramillo, to Dartmouth.
Okay, so is that working? Is that microphone working? Okay. So thanks for inviting me, and this is this is the first time I give a keynote anywhere, so thank you for that. And also, it's a strange talk because they asked me to talk about me in addition to talking about my work, which I haven't done before. So I'm a little trying to combine both talking about me and my research. So to start, I have 3 degrees in civil and environmental engineering, but I've never been a practicing engineer of any kind. My undergraduate degree in civil and environmental engineering is from Florida International University, which I got in 2003. I then went to Carnegie Mellon to do a master's in civil and environmental engineering, and it was a professional degree program. The first meeting I had with my academic advisor, he asked me if I would be interested in staying for a PhD, and my answer was like, no, I don't want to be a professor. And it turns out I didn't really know. I came from a very large university. It was a lot of commuting students, so I didn't really know what professors, like the breadth of things that professors do. I didn't really understand the big component of research that can be part of a professor. So I started doing some research during my master's on landfill gas to energy projects, and I really liked doing research, so I thought, I'll stay for a PhD. And so I stayed for my PhD. It was in the same department, so I just kind of continued. It wasn't like there wasn't much of a break between master's and PhD. It was just one continuous thing. And then I worked for my PhD, I worked on life cycle assessment of energy systems, particularly natural gas and coal systems. I defended my thesis in December of 2007, and I was 7 months pregnant when I defended my thesis. There was the room was packed, which was very nerve-wracking, and there was a very senior professor from the Tepper School of Business, an economist, Lester Lave, who afterwards came and said he had never seen a defense, like a candidate that was so far along in her pregnancy. But it went well, And so I had a child 2 months after that, and my advisor had funding to keep me around as a postdoc, which was really convenient because I just had a child. So I stayed, and I did a postdoc from January 2008 to 2010, also in civil engineering, and continued working on LCA. So that's kind of my academic part, like the training part. And these are some examples of the work that I did during my master's and PhD. The first paper, which I haven't opened in, I don't know how long, well, actually I opened it yesterday to take an image of it, came out in 2005. It was based on my master's work, and we were looking at landfill gas to energy projects and how does it make economic sense to recover methane generated in landfills to generate electricity, and what are the environmental emissions benefits for that. That was the first paper I ever submitted to a journal, and it's the only paper that came back with no review requests. It was just go. And I was like, are they sure? So that never happened again. My second paper from my thesis was this paper on life cycle of natural gas, liquefied natural gas, and coal. I was telling someone earlier this afternoon that is my most cited paper. Like from all the papers I've written, that's my most cited paper. And I look back at it and I'm like, I could have done so much better. And some people have done so much better, including another PhD student that worked under my supervision when I became faculty. But the paper has been widely cited because it was one of the first papers looking at methane emissions from natural gas systems. And when the shale gas revolution started in 2011, this just became a very hot topic of interest, and everyone has to cite my paper because it was the first one in the area. So those were my first papers. And so I started in 2008 on my postdoc, and in 2010, it had been 2 years, I figured I need to start thinking what I'm gonna do. And I started looking at, I applied for a couple faculty positions, including Minnesota, where Elizabeth used to be, and I didn't even get invited for an interview. And then just by chance, there was a professor in the Department of Engineering and Public Policy that had just received a very large grant to look at renewable integration in the US grid, and he needed someone to help him manage the grant. And so I transitioned to a research faculty position in the Department of Engineering and Public Policy, and I was the executive director of this project that had like 10 PhD students, and we were looking, broadly speaking, at renewable energy integration. I had never done power system, like I hated Introduction to Electrical Engineering in my undergraduate curriculum. And suddenly I'm in a position where I have to start learning, like for this project, I had to learn about reactive power and then doing economic dispatch models. And so all these power system stuff, and obviously a power system person would very rapidly say, I cannot even attempt to call myself a power system person, so I don't, but I've been doing a lot on power systems modeling. And then as a research faculty, you are supposed to bring your own funding to cover your salary and fund your PhD students. So that's a lot of funding you have to bring, which is not very sustainable. So in 2012, 2 years into this, I thought I need to start thinking about leaving and finding a tenure track position. And then they moved me to a tenure track position at CMU in the Department of Engineering and Public Policy. And I was like, okay, well, I'm staying. And then earlier this year, they gave me tenure. So I just got, at CMU tenure, the tenure clock is 9 years. So it's a long tenure. So I was an associate professor without tenure, and I got promoted to full professor with tenure. And so now they can't get rid of me. And so I'm there. So I had been doing all this work on life cycle assessment, and through when I started working as a professor, I started doing more work on renewable systems. And so we published a book, Variable Renewable Energy and the Electric Grid. I do not recommend writing a book. I heard someone said recently that that everyone should write a book, and I thought, oh, no, it is not a pleasant activity. I much rather write papers. So we wrote a book, and I can say I wrote a book that is sold on Amazon, so I guess that's a good thing. And then I started doing some work, again, on implications. So I had a postdoc that looked at what happens to the emissions from CO2 emissions from the power system as we retire coal plants, but also include more renewable generation. And then I had a student. This is actually very hot subject right now because we have a lot of nuclear power plants in the US that are somewhat old. They all have licenses to continue operating for at least 20 more years, but the economics aren't working in their favor, so they're being retired. And so we were looking prematurely. So we were looking at what are the emission implications of retiring 20% of our generating capacity, or actually of our generation assets, and what happens to emissions in the power sector. So my student came up with the title, Going Nuclear for Climate Mitigation, and that came out. At this time, I also had the opportunity to work with a student from Brazil. I'm originally from Colombia and had always tried to figure out how to do something related to Latin America, but I had never really kind of figured it out. And then I had this student from Brazil that came and wanted to work in Brazil, so we did really cool work looking at hydropower development in the Brazilian Amazon. So Brazil has very large plans for developing hydropower plants in the Brazilian Amazon, which sounds to me like a no-no from many different reasons. But one of them is that tropical reservoirs are known sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And I thought, I'm an environmental engineer. I know anaerobic digestion. We can do some modeling of this. It turned out to be way more complicated because there are no quick papers. So it took a much longer. The supplemental information for this paper is 60 pages long. So the student was a great student. And then we said, okay, we've identified a problem. This could be a large source of greenhouse gas emissions. What can Brazil do instead of building hydropower plants in the Amazon? So he also did another paper looking at a power system, like simulating the power system with non-hydro resources. So I was very happy. We also did another paper on socioeconomic impacts of hydropower projects in Brazil. So I was very excited because that allowed me to publish on issues related to South America. But then my student graduated and left me, abandoned me. He's back in Brazil. He's doing great. He just had a baby. We stay in touch. But losing, really, like not losing, but when your graduate students leave, it's a bittersweet moment because you've worked with them, you really like them, hopefully. Some of my students have all it's very like the best part of my job is working with the graduate students. So when they leave, it's good for them, but it's sad for me. So that's what I had been doing, and we were moving along. And then in 2014, I was reviewing the applications for PhD students, and there was a really good applicant. And he was interested in coming to EPP, but he was only interested in working on Africa issues. Like he had been in Burkina Faso for the Peace Corps, and then had done a master's in South Africa, and then had stayed and married a South African woman. So he really just wanted to do energy research in Africa. And just because of serendipity again, I had funding that was unallocated and I could hire him. And so with that, my work in Africa started, and it's what I'm very passionate about. I like this map, which it's one of those maps where like the search terms or the words that are closely associated with a subject. And like we think of Africa as there's a lot of conflict and war and all these other things, but I like this figure because it had hope at the center, and I'm holding on to Africa as my hopeful place. So with these, we just with one PhD student who really only wanted to work on issues related to Africa, we have now, so that's Nathan Williams, who is now, he stayed as a research faculty because we got a big grant that he's managing, but we have now expanded, and we have this group that is working specifically on issues related to energy environment in Africa. And so I'm from Colombia, and when I tell people that I'm from Colombia and that I'm working in Africa, they look at me weird. Why are you working on Africa? So why Africa, you ask? It became clear to me that Africa's energy development pathways will determine what happens to climate change and to environmental sustainability in general. And so we keep hearing about, I assume everyone here is familiar with climate change, and this is a crisis. And we keep hearing about the need to reduce emissions. Even some studies suggest 100% reduction by 2050. And so a lot of the focus is, what are we going to do in the US? We need to worry about China. We need to worry about India. We need to reduce their emissions. in Africa, we need to avoid emissions. And so this is what, like, I realized, like, oh my God, Africa, no one is thinking about this. So Africa, this is a figure that looks at historically cumulative CO2 emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And not surprising, right? We are one of the, like, the US is like the largest contributor to cumulative CO2 emissions. China has caught up because they've just been emitting so much. Like, Africa barely shows up, right? Their emissions are very, very small. And so no one thinks about Africa when we're talking about climate emission mitigation, because there's just not much to mitigate there. But Africa is the fastest growing, has the fastest growing population. So this is a map that shows, that scales the areas of the continents based on the projected population by 2100. And by 2100, the UN expects that there will be 4.5 billion people in Africa. By 2050, that's 2.5 billion. Currently, there are around 1 billion. Population in China and India is actually stabilizing. It's going to stay kind of at around the 1 billion. So Africa is where really growth is happening. And so I started running some numbers, and I'll walk you through these. So in 2016, the greenhouse gas emissions from the US was about 6.5 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalent, right? That translates to an intensity of 20 metric tons per person. So, like, we can say on average, we are all producing on every year 20 metric tons of CO2 per person. Latin America, which is what I know because it's where I came from, the intensity is much lower. It's 3.1 metric tons per person, so that's much lower. And Africa currently is less than close to 1 metric ton per person. So, like, clearly, this is not, I mean, this is orders of magnitude. But if we think about 2.5 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa by 2050, if they if they followed a development path that leads to a per capita carbon intensity that is like ours in the US, there would be, the emissions would be 50 trillion, 50 billion metric tons, right? So that's, no one is saying that Africa will get to 20 metric tons per person, but even if they get to the current intensity of Latin America, that's 14 billion metric tons of CO2, which is more like almost double what the US has right now. And so this is a lot of just what if, but what this tells me is we could avoid the emissions from the US. If we don't do something about avoiding emissions from Africa, it doesn't matter, right? We'll just replace everything and even double. In addition, sub-Saharan Africa has serious air quality problems. So there was a report by I think the OECD that reported 700,000 premature deaths per year in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's more than deaths in the continent as a result of malnutrition. And very few people know about this. And actually, if you've spent time in Africa, you see the problems with air quality. The other challenge we have there is that we're not monitoring it. Again, we don't think about Africa in terms of energy and environment. So this map shows the number of cities that have monitoring networks for air pollution. And so the US has a lot, China now has a lot because China has had horrible air pollution problems. There's basically nothing in Africa, right? We are not monitoring air pollution. We don't know where the sources are coming from. We have ideas, but we don't really understand what's going on. And so then population growth, problems with air quality, then to further highlight this issue, this is the continent where people don't have access to energy right now. So in 2016, close to 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa did not have access to electricity. This map shows access rates around the continent, and you have some countries where the DRC, for example, 68% of the population, or 68 million people, do not have access to a connection of electricity. And so if we think about development and population growth, they're going to need energy. And so the growth of demand of energy in Africa is just, the potential is huge. And so we bring all of these together, and I start getting very worried about the future of environmental sustainability. So I'm looking at all these things. I have this student that wants to work on issues related to Africa. I have never been to Africa. But it turns out CMU has a campus in Rwanda. So for very strange, like it's just a long story, but CMU has actually is the only US university with a campus in sub-Saharan Africa with a physical. We're granting degrees in masters in electrical and computer engineering and information technology. This is a photo of our new building that we're moving into this summer. And so I thought, I want to go to Africa for a year. The senior faculty in my department thought I was crazy because I didn't have tenure yet. And this is hard research to fund. I also have 2 children, a husband and 2 children, but we just all went to Africa for a year, to Rwanda. And it was like, so I had never been to Africa. It turns out Rwanda is a good place to get a first experience of Africa. Someone told me it was Africa 101, because it's a very controlled, like, I've never seen a city as clean as Kigali, which is not what people think about Africa, and so I thought, I spent a year, I have more than 2,000 photos, so I thought I would show you 3 photos. So that's me with a gorilla in the background. So Rwanda has the mountain, Rwanda, DRC, and Uganda are the only places in the world where there are the mountain gorillas. And so Rwanda has a very good program to protect the gorillas, but also have as a tourist income. So we did a very, very hardcore hike where I thought I'm gonna die here. I took my 71-year-old dad and father, and I thought, oh my God, he's gonna die here, and how are we gonna get him out? But he managed. And then these are just photos of, we went to Namibia. Some of these are in Rwanda. We went to Namibia, Botswana while we were there. It was a great experience for my kids who turned 9 and 7 when we were there. They actually my daughter had a very hard time coming back to the US. She was fine when we went there. She had a hard time coming back. So this was fun, but I also got to see what energy poverty looks like in real life. And these are photos I took in Kigali. So this is just a hut where they keep the biomass and the charcoal that they use. These are the cook stoves. And then I want to know if anyone knows what's going on in this one. What are you seeing here? What is that man doing? He's ironing, right? So it's a charcoal iron. So this man in a neighborhood in Kigali, his business is like a laundry service. And so it's all they don't have washers and dryers. So it's all hand washed, which means you have to iron. Because if you air dry, like, you need ironing. I never used ironing, but it turns out that's why people iron in developing countries. And so he uses charcoal, and it took me like a second to figure out what was going on. And then I remember that my mom had like some of these charcoal irons that she had gotten from her grandfather that were on display somewhere in my house as decoration. But I've shown these photos, so he was using charcoal irons. This is how they were ironing. And I brought these up to some of the students that I were taking a class when I was in CMU Africa, and they're like, yeah, that's how we iron. I was like, mind blown, right? I've shown these to students, to undergraduate students, and at different talks in the US, and it takes them a while to realize what's going on, because we don't see these things here. So this is what we're talking about. This is what we're dealing with and trying to increase energy access, which I thought this was just really eye-opening. It's very different to hear about it than to actually see it. So then again, over the 5 years, we've been building this research, and I want to, because I'm also supposed to talk about research a little bit, so I want to talk to you about 2 projects that two of my students have been working on. One of my students has been looking at the environmental cost implications of backup diesel generators in sub-Saharan Africa. And then based on that work, another student is looking at the opportunities for using distributed energy systems for urban consumers in Nigeria. And so in urban areas in sub-Saharan Africa, there are millions that are connected to the unreliable grid. So I already mentioned before that there are 600 million people without access to a connection to electricity. There are millions more that have a connection to electricity, but there's blackouts and brownouts. So basically, you have a plug, but it doesn't have power. You don't get power for hours at a time. And so what happens is they have access to electricity. With their contact, we consider that they have access to electricity, but really they just have to use, they rely on backup diesel generators. And so in some countries, like backup diesel generators can account for up to 20% of the country's available electricity generation capacity. So that's very large, right? You have these are small like gensets that when there's a storm in the US, people run to Home Depot to get some of these, right? These are small generator sets. They're very inefficient, they're very polluting. And so they're source of greenhouse gas emissions, they're source of air pollution, like air pollutants, and they're close to the population. So we started like trying to estimate what are the environmental impacts of these. And we had some very limited data. This is just for the countries, all from World Bank, publicly available data from the World Bank, with some information about these countries. I will just point out Nigeria. So it's a country with a population of 182 million people. About 55% of the population has access to electricity. And then if we convert the information we have on the World Bank, they have, like a typical customer has 4,600 hours of no power a year, right? So half the year, they have a connection, but half of the year, they don't actually have power. And the grid is not very big. It's actually 10.5 gigawatts. And some estimates suggest that about 20% of the capacity, that backup diesel generators are equivalent to 20% of the installed capacity in the centralized system. So like I said, backup diesel generators are inefficient, can be a large source of emissions. So we estimated these emissions, but also the cost of using these generators in the countries for which we had data. It took a lot of, the data is very sparse, so we had to do a lot of, understand load better and assume certain things, and we did Monte Carlo simulation to try to estimate these. And so we see that all of these countries have a significant amount of electricity generated with diesel generators, and Nigeria just stands out. Like we had to put it in a different figure because the scale, like it's like orders of magnitude more generation from backup diesel generators, which when you have half of the time of the year without power, it makes sense. In most of these countries, the generators lead to increases in CO2 emissions. We had to normalize by something so that we could put all of these in the same graph. So what we have here is kilograms of additional CO2 emissions per person with access to electricity. So the way we think a little bit about to try to understand what we're saying here is if you have a connection, if you're connected to the grid, even though you have a connection to the grid, even though some of these systems are actually quite green, because a lot of them are hydro-based power systems, you will still have an increase in emissions of about whatever we have here of CO2 in a year. And so we had to do a comparison with what the emissions from the grid would be, but most of them are positive, which means there's an increase associated. And then there's an increase in emissions from particulate matter. And so particulate matter is very concerning because particulate matter is responsible for cardiovascular and respiratory problems. It's the main driver of cardiovascular disease. And the impacts depend on exposure, right? So CO2 is a global pollutant. It doesn't matter where you emit it, it affects the entire system. But particulate matter pollution, the effects are very dependent on where it's happening and how people are exposed to it. But these are all backup diesel generators that you have in your backyard, so it's where people also live. So this could really be affecting mortality rates. And as I said, there's very little data on air quality, so we're trying to fill some of the gaps. This was kind of a scoping analysis of what diesel generators could be with lots of uncertainty things, so we're trying to build on some of these. The other thing is these are expensive. Diesel is expensive. Electricity is the price of grid electricity is typically subsidized in a lot of the countries. And so the blue is the price of electricity. If you're paying from the grid, that's the tariff. And the orange is how much you would be paying, like how much does it cost to generate your own electricity. And so in communities that are already budget limited, they're having to spend, pay significantly more to generate this electricity with their backup generators. And in some countries, we're talking about this is equivalent to billions of dollars. In Nigeria, this is equivalent to billions of dollars of additional expenditures by consumers in a year. So just to summarize, what we're seeing is that the backup diesel generators could be a problem, and they're a problem associated with customers that we think as having access to electricity, and so they're not being really, most of the discussion going on about Africa is on energy access in rural communities, not on these types of customers. So what we're trying to say is, yes, we need to worry about connectivity of unserved communities, but we also need to improve the reliability of the system for the consumers that actually have a connection. We need better data on all of these things. We need better data of how people use electricity in these both underserved communities and grid-connected communities. And we need better data about the operations of the grid. How often, the outage data we have is very coarse, so we had to make a lot of assumptions. And so the next project, we said, okay, we know Nigeria is a problem. I have a student from Nigeria. So what can we do to replace these backup diesel generators? So in urban areas, increase reliability, having battery systems in your household, like the Tesla Powerwall, except in Africa, they're all lead-acid batteries, but same idea. Or having rooftop systems, which I don't know how common they are in New Hampshire, but they're increasingly common in houses around the US. I just got a battery, a solar rooftop system, or urban mini-grids. In rural areas, some of the same solutions exist, but we're going to be focusing for this on battery and rooftop solar systems to add to the diesel. And again, we're focusing in Lagos because it's a big city where there's a lot of backup diesel generators. And so the model, this is work in progress. He's still working on these. So we need data on demand at an hourly resolution. So we've been doing some typical load data or demand of electricity data for households. We also needed to develop a model where we can say, you have a year, every hour of every year, do you have power? If you're a household, do you have power? Do you not have power? And so it's an outage model of when do you have power? And when the power goes off, how long is it off? And then that fits into a model that says, okay, if I don't have power, I'm now going to use either my solar system or battery storage, or in the worst case, diesel backup. So we maintain the diesel. And then that links into a financial model to figure out if this is something that would be economically viable for customers. We have to do a lot of parametric sensitivity analysis on all of these things, so we're working on that. But some of the preliminary results we have is, we had to also, so households may have different needs, right? I may be willing to, so in my house, we lose power, and we will only turn on our backup diesel generator if it's between the hours of 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. Otherwise, if the power goes out at 3 p.m., I just go without power. I don't care about those areas. So you really just want power during nighttime, like nighttime hours. And so the economics are different. So here, this is the dispatch. You can see the grid can be used to charge the battery in this system, so that's one of the benefits. But this is just a figure showing how the system is operating. And so you have the purple is electricity from the grid charging the battery, and then the blue is when the grid is on and you're just using the electricity from the grid. And then green is when you're actually now discharging your battery during the times you don't have power between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. And so because we're saying these customers are only willing to pay for backup electricity during the hours of 6 to 10, they have unmet energy and unmet demand if the power went off at 3 p.m. Like they would have used the electricity if they had it, but they don't have it and they're not willing to turn on their generators. So that's what the grade shows. The grade shows. Now, in these customers, they're only willing to turn on their diesel generators in the base case if the electricity is off between 6 and 10. But if you have a solar heat system, that electricity is free. So if your power goes out at 3, you're not willing to turn on the generator, but you can use the electricity from the solar PV. So that's also why unmet demand decreases in those systems. And then there are some customers that want reliability, like you just want power all the time. And so here, more power. The batteries are being discharged more. And so this is just a different where the power is flowing in the system. And then the economics of these are just net present costs over a 15-year period. And this is in the Nigerian currency, so we didn't have to deal with foreign exchange rates. So, because in Nigeria, it's not very stable, so it could be very different. But what we're seeing is that this grid with so a grid connection, and then you add battery and solar, and you still have your diesel generators for sometimes, these systems make economic sense. And so what we're moving on to is trying to see if we also account for the reductions in emissions, like how much are we talking about? We're performing a lot of parametric uncertainty analyses and more of these emissions. But as a result of all this work, we've been doing a lot of work with off-grid energy systems in rural communities. But what came out of this work with the diesel generator is that, so the Sustainable Development Goal 7 calls for universal energy access globally. So the Sustainable Development Goals were produced by the United Nations a couple years ago, and it's 16 goals of what we are striving towards. And so Sustainable Development Goal 7 is energy access, there's eliminating poverty, gender equity, so all these goals. And so a lot of the focus in the international community, in the aid community, has been connectivity, so just building connections. But if you really want to meet the goal, you also need to worry about reliability, not just so if you build a connection, but the power doesn't get there, that doesn't really help, and clean generation. So if we all just go into coal-based, that's concerning. And so this is what I'm still doing some work related to US systems, but my primary research moving forward is in this area. And so to end, back to me, I guess, I wanted to leave you with some thoughts about my experience in academia. Keep in mind, I've been a professional student all my time. I never went to industry. I did an internship once, but have not worked in the real world. So the first thing is that being a professor is not only about teaching. I mean, there are universities where the primary goal is teaching, and those universities are really just teaching-focused universities. But there are also universities like Carnegie Mellon, and I guess to a certain extent here also, that are very research-heavy and so heavy. So for me, research is actually the most exciting part of my job. I'm working with PhD students and publishing papers, and even writing proposals is the exciting part of being in academia. If you're going to go in this path or in any path you choose, work on problems that matter. This actually was what the professor that told me that I was very pregnant when I did my thesis. He passed away in 2011. He was one of the first people to make he was an environmental economist. He was one of the first people to make a link between air pollution and health effects. And he used to tell people, work on problems that matter. The other thing is what you do in school does not determine what you will do for the rest of your career. What you do in your undergrad doesn't necessarily mean, I mean, I have a civil engineering background. Don't ask me to do anything about civil engineering. I can't design a beam or the size of a pipe. And even if you're in grad school and you go and do a PhD, what you do in your PhD doesn't mean that that's what you're going to have to do for the rest of your career, right? One of the things I think a PhD you learn is, or something it teaches you is to learn new things. And so the tools that you acquire doing your PhD will allow you to go in other directions. So I started with life cycle assessment, and I started doing power systems, even though I have never taken a power systems class. And then I'm doing Africa work. So, and so the way to transition into things is be intellectually curious and flexible, right? Look at opportunities when they come, but also don't wait for them to just land on your lap. So I keep telling my some of the junior faculty that I talk to, they're always just waiting for someone asks them if they might be interested in a proposal, and they're like, well, this is what I do. How do you think it fits? And I keep saying, think about, this is the area of interest. How does what I do fit within that? How can I contribute? Rather than waiting for people to ask you to do something that you know how to do. And so and I think, this is in academia, but I think in general in life, just being intellectually curious and learning and being flexible helps. Take calculated risks. So, don't jump off a bridge or there are risks that are not worth taking. But when I told my department head that I wanted to go to Rwanda for a year, he was very supportive, but I know some of the senior faculty in my department thought I was crazy. They never said it to my face, but I know that they were talking about it. And then the department head confirmed it after I came back, and it went okay. But I really wanted to do this, and I thought I can show this is going to be useful for my career, and if then CMU doesn't want to give me tenure, someone else will. That's what I thought. Then get used to rejection. This is in academia. I don't know if this is true in the real world. And so what do I mean by this? So I went to NSF. We submitted a lot of proposals, and I went to NSF, and this is the history not full history, of my proposals that I've submitted to NSF, I think since 2014 or something. What's important here is the number of declines. So decline, 1 awarded, 2 awarded, decline, right? So we get a lot of rejections, which can be very demoralizing. Which takes me to then this is my second to last law, is your mental health is important. Your health is important. And some of you are freshmen, so this is true from freshmen until, I don't know, until you're my age. So the ones that are even undergrads, the imposter syndrome is real. I don't know if everyone has heard about the imposter syndrome, but many high-achieving individuals have this sense that they are not good enough to be wherever they are, to do whatever they're doing. It affects women. It affects men and women, but it affects women more. And it can be, like, it took me 10 years to figure out that they were not going to kick me. They were not going to realize that I didn't belong and they were going to kick me out. And it caused a lot of anxiety. So take care of your health, whatever that means. Eat healthy. I don't do that, but whatever it is, find a good mentor. I've had, since I started my faculty career, I had very good PhD advisors. I had 2, and they are family. And then I've had a very good mentor as a junior faculty member. She has been awesome, and like I had some challenges in the process with some senior faculty, and she was very supportive. And then my last one, and this is for everyone, is go to therapy. And I mean, I'm not joking. I had and I tell this to everyone because I think there's a lot of, I tell this to my PhD students and I tell this to strangers in a big auditorium. Because, I mean, it's a stressful world. I think everyone should go to therapy. I've been going to therapy for 10 years. I try to go every 2 weeks. When I lived in Rwanda, I didn't go as much, but I had like Skype meetings with my therapist. And sometimes we're not talking about anything specific, right? Like sometimes, well, she's the one that helped me get through my imposter syndrome. But just, you know, it's someone that I go to vent, and then she tells me about this cool video. I saw yesterday a video about an iguana being rescued in the middle of the ocean. And so we talk about like Game of Thrones, all kinds of things. And so like there's no shame in looking for help when you struggle. And it's important that we remove the stigma from mental health. So if you're an undergrad, I imagine Dartmouth is it's an Ivy League. You were all the best students wherever you were, and you come to a place. Someone has to be average, right? By definition, someone has to be average. And so I see this a lot at CMU where students are really struggling because they've never been average. They've always been the best, but it's okay to be average sometimes. And if you're struggling with that, then first of all, realize that it's okay. And it's hard to realize that, so go to therapy. And then this is a phrase or a saying that I've liked since high school. In Spanish, I like it better. It's solo sé que nada sé. And it appears in some of Plato's writings, and he attributes it to Socrates. So in English, the translation is, I neither know nor think that I know, which has been more commonly paraphrased as I know that I know nothing. And I know, like, I'm not a philosopher, but I'm sure philosophers have really studied what this, or dissected what this means. To me, this means, it's not that I don't know anything, it's that there is always more to learn. And that you have to be humble in realizing that you don't know everything, and also be humble to just work with other people so you can learn more, and they can learn more. And so that's what I have. You can find more information in some of these websites, or you can send me an email. Did I go over time a lot? Sorry. Did I go very much over time? Okay.
I have a question about, you said that there isn't very much monitoring of air pollution in Africa. Do you guys have plans to put monitors out, or?
So when I was in Rwanda, I took 5 monitors with me, like in suitcases. We kind of sneaked them through costumes. And we just submitted, that's not my area, but I convinced the people doing air quality, and we just submitted a paper with the results of that. We've been trying to get funding, like the logistics of that. This is when I realized I don't like field work. We didn't have funding, so this was just all like with resources we had, and the sensors break, or the SIM card does not communicate. And so we've been trying to figure out how to fund a broader campaign, and we're still in discussions, but no one wants to fund this. Yeah?
I was just wondering why Africa has such bad air pollution when they're not really emitting any carbon emissions.
Well, they're emitting a lot of carbon emissions. It's just that it's all biomass-based. So most of the emissions, particularly in rural areas, comes from biomass burning. So cooking and lighting. So, I mean, you get off the plane in Rwanda and you smell it. And the issue is that biomass burning actually smells nice, so it doesn't smell like the pollution that you would think about in the US. But the particulate matter emissions from biomass combustion are very bad. So it's mostly biomass combustion. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.